Averroes, defender of reason in Islam. Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmed ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, was a towering figure in 12th century Andalusia, a philosopher, physician, and legal scholar who earned the title Defender of Reason in Islam. He lived during a period of intense intellectual and political ferment, where the philosophical tradition, which had flourished in the earlier Islamic Golden Age, was increasingly under attack from theological and religious purists. Averroes saw himself as a direct descendant of the great philosophers of the past, particularly Aristotle, and he dedicated his life to a courageous defense of rational inquiry. His defense of reason was not an act of rebellion against faith, but an act of intellectual piety. He believed that the human intellect was a divine gift, and that to use it to its fullest potential in understanding the world and the nature of God was the highest form of worship. In an age where the influential theologian al-Ghazali had famously castigated philosophers for their incoherence, Averroes emerged as a powerful countervoice, a champion who argued that philosophy was not only compatible with Islam, but was in fact commanded by it. His life and work were a testament to the idea that intellectual inquiry, far from being a threat to religious faith, was its most profound and necessary partner. His intellectual courage in the face of a rising tide of conservatism has made him a timeless symbol of the struggle for free thought. Philosophy and religion can coexist. Averroes's vision. One of Averroes's most significant and enduring contributions to intellectual history was his unwavering belief that philosophy and religion can coexist in perfect harmony. He addressed this question directly in his seminal work, Al-Fasl al-Maqal, the decisive treatise, where he argued that the study of philosophy is not only permissible, but is an obligation for a Muslim. Averroes's vision was rooted in a profound conviction that truth is one and indivisible. Since both philosophy, which relies on rational demonstration, and religion, which is based on divine revelation, ultimately emanate from the same divine source, they cannot be in conflict. Averroes explained this harmony by distinguishing between the different ways that truth is presented to different audiences. He argued that the Quran, as a universal text, uses rhetorical and metaphorical language that can be understood by the masses. The literal meaning of the text is for those who are not trained in philosophy. For the elite, the philosophers who are intellectually capable, the Quran's truths can be understood through rigorous rational demonstration and a deeper metaphorical interpretation. When there appears to be a conflict between a literal reading of Scripture and a philosophical conclusion, Averroes insisted that the philosophical conclusion, which is based on certain logical demonstration, must be correct, and the Scripture must therefore be interpreted metaphorically. This vision was a powerful and systematic attempt to resolve the perennial conflict between faith and reason, and it became a cornerstone of his entire intellectual project. The Commentator, Averroes and Aristotle. Averroes is justly known throughout history as the Commentator, a title he earned through his monumental work on the philosophy of Aristotle. For Aristotle, Aristotle was not just a great philosopher, he was the pinnacle of human reason, the master whose works provided the most perfect and systematic account of the universe. Averroes's mission was to revive and clarify Aristotle's true meaning, which he felt had been obscured and distorted by later commentators and Neoplatonic influences. He dedicated a significant portion of his life to writing a series of commentaries on virtually all of Aristotle's works. He wrote 3 distinct types of commentaries: short commentaries, a brief summary of the text; Middle commentaries. A more detailed exposition, paraphrasing the text and providing a concise explanation. Long commentaries. A meticulous, line-by-line analysis of the text, often a book in itself, where he engaged with other commentators and presented his own definitive interpretation. These commentaries were so comprehensive and insightful that they became the primary source for understanding Aristotle for centuries. When his works were translated into Latin, they were so clear and powerful that they revolutionized the study of philosophy in medieval Europe. Averroes's work was the single most important factor in the reintroduction of a pure Aristotle to the West, and it laid the foundation for the great philosophical syntheses of the scholastic period. Averroes and the unity of truth. A core principle of Averroes's epistemology was his belief in the unity of truth. He argued that there is only one reality, and therefore there can only be one truth. This truth can be accessed through two distinct but ultimately complementary paths: the path of divine revelation and the path of philosophical demonstration. For Averroes, these two paths were not in conflict. When both are properly pursued, they lead to the same ultimate conclusion. He explained this by dividing humanity into three groups based on their intellectual capacity. The rhetorical class. The vast majority of people who are persuaded by rhetorical arguments and the literal, metaphorical language of Scripture. This is the truth as presented in the Quran for the masses. The dialectical class. Those with a higher intellectual capacity who are persuaded by dialectical arguments and logical reasoning. This group is capable of a deeper understanding of religious texts. The demonstrative class. The small intellectual elite, the philosophers, who are capable of understanding truth through rigorous, scientific, and logical demonstration. For them, a full understanding of the world and God comes from philosophy. Averroes believed that the Quran speaks to all three groups. The truth is one, but its mode of expression is tailored to the capacity of the audience. The apparent contradictions between philosophy and Scripture are simply a result of a misinterpretation of the text. He argued that the philosopher, through demonstration, arrives at a more complete and profound understanding of the truth that is presented in a simpler form to the masses. This vision of a single truth, expressed in different ways, provided a powerful framework for reconciling faith and reason. The incoherence of the incoherence. A rebuttal to al-Ghazali. Averroes' most famous philosophical work, The Incoherence of the Incoherence, Tahafut al-Tahafut, was a direct and systematic response to al-Ghazali's attack on philosophy in his Tahafut al-Falasifa. For Averroes, al-Ghazali's book was a devastating blow to the intellectual tradition and a source of confusion that needed to be rectified. Averroes' book is structured as a point-by-point rebuttal, where he meticulously quotes al-Ghazali's arguments and then refutes them with a vigorous defense of philosophy. Averroes systematically defended the philosophical doctrines that al-Ghazali had deemed heretical. He argued for the eternity of the world not as a denial of a creating God, but as a rejection of creation in time. He believed that the world was an eternal and necessary emanation from God, who is the eternal cause. He also defended the philosophical understanding of God's knowledge, causality, and the nature of the afterlife. For Averroes, al-Ghazali's attack on causality, which claimed that there was no necessary link between cause and effect, was a dangerous idea that undermined the very possibility of science and the study of the natural world. He argued that al-Ghazali's criticisms were not based on sound logic, but on a flawed understanding of philosophy. This intellectual clash between Averroes and al-Ghazali represents the pinnacle of the medieval debate between faith and reason in Islam. Averroes in Latin Europe. The rise of Latin Averroism. While Averroes's influence was eventually suppressed in the Islamic world, it had a revolutionary and long-lasting impact on Latin Europe. Beginning in the 12th century, his works, particularly his extensive commentaries on Aristotle, were translated into Latin and introduced to the great universities of Paris and Padua. This influx of Averroes's works had an electrifying effect on European intellectual life, which had been starved for a more complete and systematic understanding of Aristotle. His interpretations of Aristotle were so powerful and comprehensive that they gave rise to a new philosophical school known as Latin Averroism. This school, which flourished in the 13th and 14th centuries, was defined by its rigorous adherence to what was seen as the true rationalist philosophy of Aristotle, as interpreted by Averroes. This often led to conflict with Christian theology. For example, Latin Averroists, following Averroes, taught the eternity of the world and the unity of the human intellect, doctrines that directly contradicted Christian dogma. The Church and other scholastic thinkers, most notably Thomas Aquinas, were forced to engage with these ideas and develop their own counter-arguments. Thus, Averroes's influence was not just in introducing Aristotle to the West, but in forcing Western thinkers to grapple with the profound and sometimes uncomfortable consequences of pure reason. Rational soul and immortality in Averroes's thought. One of Averroes's most controversial and debated theories concerned the nature of the rational soul and immortality. Unlike many other philosophers who believed in the individual immortality of the human soul, Averroes offered a radically different and more abstract interpretation. He distinguished between two types of intellect. The individual material intellect. This is a faculty of the individual human soul that is tied to the body. It is corruptible and perishes with the death of the body. It is responsible for sensory perception and memory. The universal active intellect. This is a single, eternal, and incorporeal substance that is separate from all individual beings. It is a cosmic intelligence, the source of all human knowledge. Averroes's controversial claim was that true immortality was not personal, but a form of intellectual union with this single, universal intellect. When an individual human being learns and understands, their individual intellect comes into contact with the universal intellect. After death, only the universal intellect, which is shared by all of humanity, remains. This meant that there was no personal immortality, no individual heaven or hell. This theory was deeply troubling to both Islamic and Christian theologians, as it seemed to contradict a core belief in individual salvation and the afterlife. This theory, which was a central tenet of Latin Averroism, became a primary source of conflict between Averroes's followers and the religious authorities in both traditions. The role of philosophy in Islamic law. Averroes was not just a philosopher, but also a respected legal scholar, qadi, and his background in Islamic law profoundly shaped his views on the relationship between philosophy and religion. In his work, Al-Fasl al-Maqal, he makes a bold and systematic argument that the pursuit of philosophy is not only permissible, but is in fact obligatory for a Muslim. He grounded this claim in the Quran itself. He argued that the Quran repeatedly commands believers to use their reason, to reflect on God's creation, and to seek knowledge of God. For Averroes, the most perfect form of reflection and knowledge of God's creation is philosophy, which he defined as the study of being as being. Therefore, a Muslim who engages in philosophy is fulfilling a divine command. He also argued that there is no conflict between the conclusions of philosophy and the true meaning of Scripture. He applied the principles of legal interpretation, ijtihad, to philosophy, arguing that just as a legal scholar must use reason to interpret the law, a philosopher must use reason to interpret the deeper, metaphorical meanings of the Quran. Averroes's unique position as both a philosopher and a legal scholar gave him the authority and insight to make this powerful and enduring case for the legitimacy of rational inquiry within Islam. Ibn Rushd and the clash of traditions. The life of Ibn Rushd, Averroes, was a microcosm of the larger clash of traditions in 12th century Andalusia. He lived in a society that was a crossroads of different intellectual and religious currents, and his own life was caught in the middle of a conflict between the rationalist philosophical tradition and the more conservative anti-rationalist and traditionalist theological movements. He enjoyed the patronage of several Almohad caliphs who were initially sympathetic to philosophy. This political support allowed him to produce his great works and to flourish as a scholar. However, the political climate was unstable, and the rise of a more orthodox and puritanical faction within the Almohad dynasty led to his fall from grace. He was publicly disgraced, his books were burned, and he was exiled. This dramatic turn of events, which occurred late in his life, symbolized the broader rejection of philosophy that was taking place in the Islamic world at the time. Averroes's tragic fate was a testament to the powerful tension between intellectual freedom and religious orthodoxy. His life became a symbol of a golden age of philosophy that was coming to an end in the Islamic world, even as his works were being translated and sparking a new intellectual renaissance in Europe.
Averroes' enduring influence on Western thought. The enduring influence of Averroes on Western thought is one of the great ironies of intellectual history. While his ideas were largely forgotten or rejected in the Islamic world after his death, they became a central and transformative force in medieval Europe. His works, particularly his commentaries on Aristotle, were instrumental in the reintroduction of Greek philosophy to the West. Prior to him, the knowledge of Aristotle was limited, but Averroes provided a complete and coherent system that was both comprehensive and intellectually rigorous. His influence can be seen in several areas. He was a foundational figure in the development of scholasticism, and his commentaries became a primary source for the great scholastic syntheses of the 13th century. Thomas Aquinas, the most important of the scholastic philosophers, was heavily influenced by Averroes, often using his commentaries as a starting point and a foil for his own theological and philosophical arguments. The rise of Latin Averroism, a school of thought that fiercely defended Averroes's rationalist interpretations, forced the Church to engage with and ultimately integrate reason into its theological framework. His ideas on the harmony of faith and reason and his bold defense of philosophy were instrumental in shaping the intellectual climate of the Renaissance. The legacy of Averroes in the West is not just in the specific ideas he presented, but in the new ways of thinking that he introduced, which ultimately helped to pave the way for the scientific revolution and the modern age.